could I invite the speakers to come up to the front? So, because we kept a very good time, we have a bit of time for some conversation and discussion. So I'm very keen to... Oh, we have a microphone. Thank you. I'm very keen to open things up to the floor so that I'm not dominating things. Malcolm, you have a question. Could you wait for a microphone? It won't be for me, it will be for you.
I think all three of those presentations were amazing, so thank you all. One thing, particularly in relation to Florence and Amy, that really I saw was this notion that what we call the future is really a mode of transmission from past into present. How the past becomes the present is also what sets the tone for the future. If you think about phrases, sort of tragicomic phrases like "we were promised jetpacks," it suggests that the future doesn't run on time, it has a pace, it ought to be good, where's my stuff? And I think particularly Florence, it's a question I want to put to all three of you, because I think you raised, Florence, the problem of evil in the museum. In some way, the museum is perhaps a place that's meant to deliver us from evil, but maybe you said maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it has to do something else in order for that tick-tock, that neat journey narrative from past into present to be different, because at the moment, as you're saying quite rightly, rather than delivering anyone from evil, it's causing its own evils by excluding. So, I mean, in a way, I want to ask all three of you, should the museum deliver us from evil or not?
Sorry, can you say, should the museum
deliver us from evil?
Okay, good, stepping on. Oh, to be a bit cheeky, I think the museum should at least try, mostly because they're funded by taxpayers' money. So that's definitely a good reason to at least try. But I think it's actually quite an interesting question because, so I've just recently been acquainted with a collective called Museum Detox, and there's one of the quite sort of senior, or at least one of the members who's been really active in kind of curating different experiences. She had co-curated with actually some other people I also knew but didn't realise they were all curators in the Birmingham Museum. I think it's The Past Is Now. It was all about kind of the narratives of colonialism behind the development of Birmingham as a city, and then obviously behind the development of the space of the museum, as kind of this legacy of colonialism. And she wrote a really great article which was the museum cannot be decolonised, which I thought was a really interesting, and actually to be honest, I kind of mostly agree. So I have to be honest, I'm the kind of designer who sees utopias and even things like social justice and whatever. If I'm absolutely honest, I see them as things to go towards. I don't actually think they will ever happen, but I need something to propel me to make any kind of change. Anyway, so the point is that whole notion of actually it's impossible for the museum to be decolonised doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't try to do what it can to, I suppose at this stage, I think more be self-aware than anything, because actually the irony is that almost, so when I say irony, I think I'm thinking as much about the initiatives that a lot of, say, natural history museums kind of want to support in order to make science sort of more welcoming and broader, actually in a way can often sort of end up slightly bypassing the museum. So the museum begins to become softly irrelevant and obsolete in a really nice sort of way, actually. So perhaps in itself, it can only be what it is, but perhaps in trying to mitigate its evil, which it can't fully do, it can kind of open up avenues for other interesting and good things to happen, if that makes sense.
I also just wanted to talk a little bit about that idea of the kind of the linearity of a narrative from past to present, and I think that is part of the issue which underpins some of the problematics of the narrative of the museum, that there is this kind of singularity of this is the way the world has come about, this is the way it has been developed as kind of fact. And I think that one of the things that I really enjoy about working with science fiction and kind of bringing that into that context is to trouble that linearity, that these alternative visions of the future, which were developed at various moments in the past, continue to exist and continue to have kind of presence within our world, and that alongside them there are wonderful works, particularly Afrofuturist works, which talk about denied futures, or futures which were possibility and did not come to pass as well, but the writing of those futures still has presence and importance to us. And I know that's something that Florence can speak to a lot more than I can from her work. But I think part of what I really appreciate about working with kind of fictional spaces and speculative spaces is to kind of trouble that linearity and the singularity of the idea of progress within the museum.
So I guess I see the museum as a civic space. It's still a public space to a great extent, and I suppose that is the opportunity for the museum to engage with contemporary thinking and to convey, I think, important questions of our time to this civic space. I think this really sentence I love by Monica Byrne when she was interviewed about the lack of women in science fiction discourses, and she said, "Who cares about your jetpack? How can technology enable us to love each other more?" Which I thought was really interesting answer that speaks to perhaps the lack of fluffy, weird, lovable futures in what is the lexicon of those that are presented in kind of museum context sometimes, that are much more technological and shiny and male in many ways. Then in terms of sort of utopian thinking in museums, I think, because one of my just a thinker I like very much is Louis Marin, the French philosopher, and he talks about utopia as this critical practice, right? So when Thomas More writes Utopia, he describes the first book, which is one place, and the second book, which is another, and perhaps the utopia is not the second place, it's not the island, but utopia is the journey between one and the other, and it's this critical reassessment of what's the place you've left by being closer to the place you're describing or reaching, that I think is perhaps what possibly, but I see the role of I'm not sure it's a museum, but cultural practices as having that function when engaging with futures and fiction and utopias. So, thanks.
Okay. Do we have another question from the audience? Fran. There's a microphone.
My question really is to Amy about her workshop. I was interested in the fact that the workshop seemed to be taking place in what looked like a sort of semi-domestic space, and the fact that all the creations were made out of chairs and carpets and bits of cloth. I just wondered whether you considered this, or what impact it would have made if you'd done the workshop in a disused, maybe a bit of the museum that was being redeveloped, or in the museum's store of I don't know, discarded cabinets, or if you'd I mean, it seemed to me that the selection of the material was quite interesting, and I don't know what would have happened if you selected something more neutral like cardboard, or something which potentially could be futuristic, or I don't know. I just thought that the overwhelming impression of the workshop was the chairs and the domesticity. So I just wondered how that sat within the museum.
In terms of, I'll address the kind of the physical objects first. That was something which we gave quite a bit of thought to. when I'm working with architecture students, I would typically give them large pieces of cardboard because they're very happy, using Stanley knives, kind of hacking into that. But I was very aware that it was going to be a group of people whose backgrounds were I didn't know what kind of art practice they were involved in. And I thought that to use objects which were already familiar, which we were kind of had that kind of comfortable domesticity, meant that everyone who was there would have a way of knowing how to handle that object. There were no kind of barriers to engagement set up by a kind of specialist knowledge of how to put two pieces of cardboard together. In terms of the space, that was very much a product of necessity. We had tried out various different rooms there, and it was actually the room that we were in was the hands-on base, which is in the Horniman Museum, which is a fantastic room of objects which are made available to groups, and you can take stuff out of the case, physically handle it. And we really felt that was quite important to allow people to actually be interacting with an object rather than having it in a case, kind of at one level removed. But I think the idea of kind of trying it out in various different locations would be really fantastic. I'd particularly be interested in what would happen if it was played out in an archive store which was not publicly accessible, to kind of that takes never going to happen. God, you were sceptical about us being able to get the workshop together, so I hold out hope. I hold out hope that someone will let me into an archive with some weird pieces of furniture to stage something, but I don't know how probable that is.
But there may be other spaces within the museum where that is possible. There may be, but it won't be in one of their storerooms where the collection is housed. So, I mean, I'd just say, in terms of use of materials, it's very limited in terms of what you can do in that space. It is the handling collection, but it's still the collection. Yeah. So it's still it's protected. Yes.
Thank you all three for your excellent talks. I have a question that I think would be something you all feel able to respond to in some way. One thing that I kind of started to think about towards the end of Amy's talk, based on what I've been hearing from all three of you, was a sort of the idea of rendering present and of noting absence or absent. And I was thinking about how we've been talking very much about objects today, and I come from science fiction, but I don't think this is just a science fictional thing, but when you think about an absent object, right, which you either note by dint of its absence, or it's something that you expect to be there but that isn't there, or that you feel a loss of. So there can be different ways in which an object is not present or is noted to be absent. So I guess my question is, speaking as we are, not exclusively, but certainly with a certain amount of emphasis about objects, how can we approach topics of loss or elision or absence via objects? And that includes the loss either of those objects or of other objects that we may not even be able to name or note or feel, because perhaps we've forgotten them, they've been denied or lost, or we don't yet know that we had expected them or will expect them. Sorry, yeah, that's a useless ending to my question, but I hope that's something that
I started last time, so you can start.
I don't know. But I'm actually doing, so with the decorators, my practice, we are doing an expedition in July to the Azores. And I'm not sure if this may be what you're talking about, but the Azores are an archipelago that sit between three tectonic plates in the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't populated by humans. It was only in the 15th century that the Portuguese populated Azores. There was only a bat there. It was the only mammal. But since then, the Azores were a laboratory of botanical experiments, many species at the Kew Gardens have stayed there for acclimatization. And they were heavily described in the 19th century by North European rationalists, who would come to the Azores and describe, categorize, catalog species, animals, everything. And so knowing about these from the outside, we came to the Azores and we visited some institutions. One of them is this volcano home, which is this incredible 1980s museum that has like a simulated lava tunnel with soundtrack and everything. But the guide who was taking us through it started saying things like, he was explaining us very scientifically the phenomena of a volcano and all, but then he started speaking about how he, as a person who lives in the Azores, he always feels the imminence of the lava that might come out anytime, the little shaking of the earth that's present every day, and so we came up with this idea, and these are things that cannot be mappable, that cannot be categorized, classified exactly, and we found that it's perhaps in myths and in rituals that are still present today, that those experiences and I suppose dimensions of this place can come to the fore. But because we don't know that, so we've organized an expedition where we're going to go to the Azores with a group of artists who are like fantastic people and who are interested in these dimensions of the unseen. And so I'll let you know. Sorry, this was super long. I'm sorry. You don't.
I wouldn't know how to kind of materialize that either. I think the only examples that I would point to would be from kind of a background in architecture, the museum spaces which have attempted to articulate either a loss, either a loss of people, of a place, or of the stories or memories. And the one that I used in my presentation and that kind of immediately springs to mind is the Jewish Museum in Berlin, which I had the opportunity to take some architecture students to a couple of weeks ago. And there's a kind of physical manifestation of a void, of an absence, which is speaking very eloquently about the nature of loss. But the thing that I do find quite challenging about that is that it does rely on a particular affective and emotional language that building enters into with the person who visits it. And I don't think that an architecture can presume a kind of universal response in that way. So while that might be very particularly effective within that setting, within that particularly cultural context, there are problems in trying to even spatialize that void or that loss.
Oh yeah, sorry, skip that.
Well, I'm going to be cheeky, and even though I shouldn't be, I'm going to sort of weigh in on that with a couple of points. I used to work at the Royal Air Force Museum in the role of both as a photographer and as a collections management documentation officer. And the reason the Royal Air Force Museum back in the 90s had to develop a really thorough collections management policy was because they realized they were just losing so much stuff. They have around 1 million objects, and they realized they had a complete tea set from, I think, the Hindenburg that survived the incineration of a giant airship, yet had been lost in storage. They had no idea where it was or if they still had it. So part of this kind of obsession that emerged in the 1990s around collections management and knowing where every object is because otherwise you will lose it. But in the Horniman, I've come across there are a couple of sort of notable losses I've noticed recently. One of the first examples of taxidermy you see when you come into the Horniman's Natural History Gallery is a dodo. There are no taxidermy dodos. The dodo was lost. The Natural History Museum in Oxford has some shriveled up fragments, a bit of a foot, a bit of a beak. That's pretty much it. So every dodo that you see in almost every natural history museum that has taxidermy is a fake, because the species is lost. I mean, it's not just a model of extinction. There is no actual material record of it. The other kind of loss I've encountered there is I've become fascinated with a display of fossils around the balcony of the museum there, and how it kind of functions as a model of time. Essentially, it's sort of, it's a time machine as a form of museological experience. So I've been really fascinated by sort of what period of time this was formulated in. Does it go back to the kind of evolutionary discourse of the museum's formation? It doesn't, because I can see the photographs from when the museum opened. It's not there. So I start to ask the expert curators. They don't know. I start to dig around in the records. There is no record. Nobody kept a record of when those cases were put in place or when that display was put in. All I know is it's some time between the Second World War and the present. So in describing these cases, I have to say second half of the 20th century, which seems unbelievable. And you're going through the photographs and you're like, well, they're there. And then you turn the photograph over and it's like, there's no date. So you're looking at a picture of a guy in a hat and trying to think, well, is he old-fashioned? or is this further back in the past? So, yeah, there are these sort of surprising manifestations of loss that haunt the museum. And, it does not fit with, contemporary curatorial policy to have those kinds of gaps and absences. But at the same time, how can they foresee what kinds of records and things are they going to keep? When you go back through the records, there's like every meeting that this curatorial team had, every outing they went on, everywhere, this guy's just writing a diary of everything. And, is that the kind of information that curators should be keeping? So I think loss is a very rich and, very interesting thing to be thinking about.
I'm just going to be cheeky.
Yeah.
Sorry, because I was going to skip that question, obviously. But I was just thinking also kind of based on what people have been saying, and also thinking like about the design process. So in some ways we sort of cheat by saying, well, you should just expect loss. You should expect the fact that there is always going to be a void, which at least helps you feel, I suppose, comfort in the fact that there's always going to be that discomfort. Because I think that's something, it's funny, it's just because of what you were saying about kind of the geological record, and like so often sort of when you're designing an object and you don't quite know, and then it goes out amongst the people and they use it how they use it, and then something often not what you expect happens with it, and in a sense there was a loss of your requirements, there's a loss of what you thought it would be. And I always found it so similar to when I'd listen to paleontologists talk about how we thought like we had a particular idea of how, say, a particular species evolved, or we had a particular question. And actually, it's almost like the more coelacanths that get found, or the more types of things that appear, or new fossils that appear, in a way it almost gives them confidence to be able to say, actually, it may well be that we just don't have this particular fossil. Like I've personally noticed how different the way paleontology is being taught, like from when I was very young, to be like, we keep finding that this is how we know that this is what evolved into this. And now the discourse is much more like, well, this is what we have right now.
Yeah.
And they explain the reasoning why you can trust that for now, this is what we know and why we know it. But I think in that you almost, the confidence comes about because you've appreciated the loss and the absence and the fact that you just don't know everything.
Okay, one more question from Neil over there, and then we will break for coffee, which you'll find up in the canteen.
Yeah, I have a question for each of the panelists in a way seem to be talking about a struggle with the museum itself. And I wonder whether the problem is the museum. Why are we struggling to engage with an institution which may no longer be fit for purpose? And whether they could speculate about what other kind of institutional structures we might need to imagine the futures we would like. Is that a question?
I guess that's punishment for the last question.
No, in obviously you're allowed to do things on a funky late Friday evening, but you're not allowed to really mess with the institution itself. You're allowed to do a workshop in a tiny leftover space in the museum. We're not actually allowed to mess with the institutional structures itself.
Yeah.
We can tinker with the edges. abandon the museum and imagine different kind of institutions for our futures.
Yeah, I think that's actually, it's a really good point actually, and certainly so I remember when I was in Berlin last year for a discussion around kind of decolonizing natural history, and I'm an outsider, so I'm a designer who currently works in a museum, and I've worked before in museums and I love museums, but I'm not like a natural history either, like from critical studies perspective or a curator or anything like that. So it was really interesting, some of the discussions about, well, if the museum is so riddled with the legacies of colonialism and exploitation and is actually now involved in neo-colonialism, then what's next? And often the spaces that would be described reminded me so much of nature centres. I remember kind of getting into a bit of a discussion trying to explain what the nature centre could be then in a world without the Natural History Museum and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I do think obviously that there could be potentials for differences. But that question of like why we still engage with the museum, I mean, certainly for me, and again, this is very much a limitation on the way I tend to think. I suppose being a designer, I'm essentially an engineer, and I like practical things that I can touch and deal with. It also, I think, for me anyway, it kind of touches on actually the problem of nostalgia that I sort of mentioned, because certainly personally, I'm within a group, a user group or an audience group for whom the museum, for all its difficulties, is an intrinsically special space, because it was the space where I could learn things, and it's a space where I could read things by myself and look at things and see ancient and interesting things that I couldn't see in the everyday around me. And so I think in some ways perhaps we're in a very weird perhaps not quite Stockholm syndrome, but there might be something to it. Like it's something, because a lot of museums are very beautiful. A lot of them, we always make the joke that sometimes you go to the Natural History Museum 3 times in your life. Once with your child, when you're a child, once when you're a parent, or an aunt or an uncle or whatever, and you're bringing like a nibbling or a child, and then the last time when you're grey and whatever, and then you're bringing kind of like the second generation down over with you. And I think I'm just mentioning that, I guess, because that's just the reality of humans. Like, we're attached to things that showed us some inkling of love and affection. And the museum, for all its problematics, like, Richard Owens was not a particularly nice person, Hans Sloane was not a particularly nice person, but their goal is something that, of trying to give something back to the people, but give some kind of information and something interesting back to the people, I think is just the kind of thing that you can latch onto. It's just the kind of barest bit of emotional connection that we as humans, because that's what we are so susceptible to.
Do you want to answer first? Okay. Yes, I couldn't agree more, I suppose. What can I say about this? I think that it seems like the museum is it's a very recent construction, of course, which is important to think about, that it's something that we've done and we can undo, at least in its current model. But even though it's so recent, it seems incredibly at odds with contemporary thinking in terms of just the fact that it's based on a model of ownership. When we're all discussing the Anthropocene and looking at the South Hemisphere for clues as to how we might think more progressively about our relationship to the planet, and then they've got this structure that is has a hierarchy, a structure of hierarchy deeply embedded into its functioning. It just seems a little bit old-fashioned for something that is actually so recent. So I think it's urgent to think of other modes in which we can gather objects and think critically about them. But this is a paradox, because at the same time, I think that all of our public institutions seem to be at risk somehow. And the museum still is kind of the safe, is sort of a really special place, because it's public and it's indoors and it's a supporter of culture and critical thinking. So it's a paradox, but yeah, I think if we could reinvent. I think what's fundamental is, of course, the very structural DNA of these institutions in terms of power and ownership and other kinds. And then I think, as a curator, in a very practical way, museums have set formats for you to work with. It seems like there's little. As someone, I don't have an art history background, and I'm a practitioner. Coming into a museum to do an exhibition, I'm faced with a scenario where I'm going to be assigned a specific format that is, say, like 30 to 50 objects with a publication at the end, maybe a conference, or maybe it's like 100 object type of thing. And I think that there's very little room for unknown, at least in my experience, of course, for unknown outcomes. So to say we're going to start a research project and we don't know if it's going to be a publication or a film or what. So I think, that's also a challenge.
Absolutely agree with both of you. I think for me, the sort of in defence of the museum as an institution as it currently stands, I suppose that to see it as a place where potentially, although it's not enacted in that way, it is open access to anyone who would want to engage with that object, while simultaneously being a space where kind of new investigations and scientific pursuits can be undertaken with those same objects. That those objects can be facing both ways, kind of outward from a scientific perspective and kind of inward, and still being subject to investigation, I think is a really unique point. And if we were to try and think about what kind of other form that museum could take, I think we would need to think about what of that model we were prepared to lose to be able to allow for different forms of engagement or different forms of practice. And for me, one of the things that the museum does very well in its kind of rigidity is this protection and maintenance and preservation of the objects which are kind of entrusted to it. Well, certainly it has in recent history. And I suppose if we were to then start to disperse that, or to take that out into different contexts, or to allow people like us to kind of get our hands on things in the way that we would probably love to, then we would have to come to terms with the fact that some of those objects would be lost. They would be destroyed. They would have a shorter lifespan if they were not being so institutionally defended, which I don't think. It's not to say necessarily whether that would be a good or a bad thing, but it would be something that we would need to kind of collectively decide that we were happy to deal with the consequences of.
Okay, thank you. We should probably wrap up there. We're running a little bit late. Gabriella, should we say still have half an hour? 20 minutes. Okay, so if we say 22.